The marble swallowed the sound of his sneakers. The lobby was all gloss and hush, polished floors, a fountain that hissed like it had something to hide, chandeliers that threw coins of light across suits. Marcus Chen stood with a bank card the size of a postage stamp in his fingers and a question small enough to be almost invisible in that room. "I just want to check my balance," he said. His voice was so quiet that at first people continued whatever they were doing. A man on an iPad, a woman speaking a perfect business sentence into a phone, a little boy tracing the rim of a brass rail with bored fingers. Then a ripple moved out, a shift of posture, a glance drawn in the direction of his patched coat and duct-taped sneakers. The receptionist, Janet, looked up from behind the glass with the practiced smile of someone who had seen all manner of trouble and knew how to keep it at arm's length. A laugh broke out from the far side of the lobby. It did not start kindly. Richard Blackwell heard it and stepped forward as if magnetized. He wore the kind of suit that didn't wrinkle and a laugh that felt like polished metal. He crossed the room with slow, precise steps that spoke of a life spent measuring and being measured. "Balance," Richard said, the word a scalpel. "What do you mean, balance?" Marcus held the card up like an answer. The edges of the card were worn from being held. Someone had labored to keep the corners from splitting. The name printed on it read Linda Chen. The card, Marcus knew, had been left to him. A small crowd gathered because people gather when there's theater and because private banks are built in part to stage the fall of the unexpected. Phones came up before manners. Faces leaned in. A few offered a sound that pretended to be pity and made it sting worse than anything else. Richard's smile folded into something colder. "Our clients don't usually come with," he started, and the sentence filled the room like smoke. "This is a private facility." Marcus's hands were steady. He was 12. His shoulders had learned to carry more than his years should have taught them. "I just want to check my balance," he repeated. The words landed without fanfare. There was no flourish, no plea. There was only the card and the question and the way the air in the lobby thickened. Someone in the crowd tried to make light of it, a chuckle, a small, cruel echo. Others looked away. The fountain's hiss seemed louder. The receptionist tapped a key. A screen on the teller's counter spun, looking for a number, looking for a name. Cameras watched silently like a jury that accepted the room's assumptions as evidence. Then the screen stuttered and the room inhaled. Numbers marched across the monitor, a sequence that at first meant nothing to the people who did not work in sums. Then the figures arranged themselves into something that stopped the mocking and replaced it with a different kind of noise, a high, awkward silence and the low thrum of phones recording the moment. $47,300,000. The numbers seemed oversized and obscene and utterly factual, glaring white on a clinical blue. For a breathless second, the room wasn't sure where to look. Some faces went blank from shock. Others tilted toward disbelief, scanning for a mistake. Someone whispered, "No way." Richard's eyes found Marcus's face. Behind the practiced cool, there was a flicker, sharp and animal, suspicion, or the germ of something like panic. He looked back to the screen. The numbers belonged to a ledger line that bore the name Linda Chen. The card was stamped with the same. The machine, indifferent, presented proof. There was a jolt in the room. Phones forgot to film and began to tilt toward practicality. Richard's laugh dissolved into a sound that held less pride and more calculation. He motioned with an authority that had run on decades of certainty. "Hold on," he said. "Let's verify." The word pulled the crowd back to the edges like a tide. A bank manager in a navy suit came forward, crisp and blank-faced. Janet leaned forward, pushing her glasses up and making notes with a pen that seemed to have known this kind of day before. Someone in the back muttered that the boy must be a fraud, or worse, that this was some publicity stunt. Rumors are fast in rooms like this. They told themselves stories that would keep them comfortable and unchanged. Marcus watched them all with what could have been patience or was just the numbness that comes after a long day. He shuffled the card between his fingers. He did not want to be a spectacle. He did not want pity. He wanted an answer, a balance, a fact. That was the thing that had made his mother spend hours bending her hands over ledgers and late-night tutoring papers. Facts you could hold and plan with. "Do you have identification?" Janet asked, her voice softer now because they were required to be soft in the face of protocol. Marcus nodded and held out a small plastic card with his name on it, the edges frayed, the photo sun-bleached. She typed. The screen blinked and stuttered, as if it were trying to decide whether the digital world could accept such an old kindness. "This must be a mistake," a man in an expensive scarf said loudly, as if saying it harder might make the numbers shrink. The undercurrent threaded through the room. Money is for people who look like money. Money has a dress code and a certain diction. Money likes to be validated by other money. A little boy with worn shoes interrupted that flow of logic and showed a ledger entry that did not care for appearances. Richard's jaw tightened. He moved closer, as if proximity might let him measure the weight of the claim. "We will need to see how this account was set up," he said. "There are procedures." Marcus listened, then said, with the plain assurance of someone who had been taught to rely on the slow integrity of paperwork as if it were a thing of light, "My mother left a letter. She said the card would be there." At the mention of a letter, something shifted again. Curiosity pried at the edge of ridicule. The hush grew denser. Richard's eyes narrowed, not in mockery now, but in a way that suggested a man thinking in gears he had not expected to engage. "If there's paperwork," Richard said, his voice lower, "bring it to my office. Security will escort you." That was the moment Marcus should have felt small enough to disappear. Instead, he straightened and nodded. He didn't know then that the word escort in that building meant being led to a long table under bright lights and to people who spoke in forms and clauses. He only knew that someone had agreed to look, and that was all a 12-year-old could ask for. Not explanation, not comfort, just a look. There was a kindness in the way James Morrison approached. He had been in the bank long enough to know both the cold and the small necessary warmth that kept institutions breathing. He wore a cardigan under his suit, the hem a little frayed, a humanizer in a room of immaculate edges. He introduced himself with a name that sounded like a handshake. "Mr. Blackwell will join us," James said, but his tone was not triumphant. It contained the shape of someone who had seen sharp moments clothed in dignity and wanted to keep them from bleeding. He guided Marcus through a door that smelled faintly of coffee and paper. The conference room was all lambent wood and large windows that framed a downtown skyline indifferent to the life inside the building. Richard sat at the head of the table and possessed the space with the ease of a man used to being obeyed. He folded his fingers in that way polished men fold their hands over the questions they do not want asked. He fixed Marcus with a gaze that had a trace of wounded pride and something keener, a dawning discomfort. A flip of a pen, a cursor, a phone that lit with a dozen unread messages. He cleared his throat to reclaim a floor that had slipped. "This is extraordinary," he said finally. It was less a statement and more a concession to the fact that the universe occasionally produced anomalies that could not be fit into tidy files. James set a bottle of water and a sandwich on the table and placed it before Marcus the way one might place a blanket beside a sleeping child. The food was practical and unadorned. Marcus touched the paper napkin and then the sandwich, and for a second the child in him registered the luxury of not having to wonder where the next thing to eat would come from. He ate slowly, eyes never leaving Richard's face. Richard picked up the card and turned it between his fingers. Up close, his features betrayed more than the lobby had allowed. There was an edge to his breathing and a tension in his jaw, as if a memory of being made wrong by someone else had crept in. His voice, when it came, was small compared to how he had spoken in the lobby. "How? Was there a trustee?" he asked. "Documentation? An agent? This looks like an estate account. There are safeguards." James nodded and reached for the tablet on the table. Fingers moved with a practiced patience through the bank's interface. On a screen that did not leak emotion, a small digital file list opened and revealed a series of documents that had not been expected to surface here like wildflowers in winter. There were medical advisories, payment histories, and an insurance policy that, if the numbers were to be trusted, had been funded in quiet increments over a decade. "She set it up as a life insurance policy," James said, reading more to confirm for himself than to instruct the room. "And there is a trust attached to it. Managed disbursements, a trustee named, monthly allowance until legal majority, then a full release at 25. 25? Richard's tone had an edge, almost disbelieving. Why such a long hold? James's reply was gentle, rote but humanized by context. To ensure stability, to avoid sudden exposure. That's fairly common for sizable estates set up for minors. Marcus's fingers found the envelope in his backpack. The flap had been sealed with more care than a child's pockets usually held. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, the handwriting tight, small, and economical, the script of a woman who graded papers by lamplight and penciled budgets in margins. He had memorized the way his mother folded letters. There were 5 creases, each placed with the same precise nostalgia with which she had folded his sweaters at the end of winter. He unfolded it now and smoothed it on the table with a reverence that was partly ritual and partly a child's attempt to hold steady. "May I?" James asked softly. Marcus nodded. The room leaned in, as if it too wanted to learn how to be modest. Richard's expression had gone brittle, his laugh had not yet returned. He shifted in his seat, the kind of small human movements that betray a man trying to recompose a story he was certain he understood until someone snagged a thread. "Read it," someone, Janet maybe, from memory, said. James cleared his throat, and the lines he spoke carried the voice of the woman he had never met. Linda Chen, a simple teacher. Linda who rose at dawn to prep lesson plans for kids who could not always afford pencils. Linda who took tutoring jobs on weekends and clipped coupons like prayer beads. Linda who patched shoes and patched math deficits with equal care. Linda who, in the middle of a small kitchen with a leaking sink and a neighbor's cat on the counter, made a decision about what she could leave behind. The letter began, not with an explanation of dollars, but with a language teachers use. Small instructions, heart in margins, a grammar of care. "My dear ones," James read, and his voice folded into something softer. Marcus's mouth pinched as if to hold back that tug at the throat grief always finds. He had not let himself open his mother's letter in the lobby. He had been saving that private ritual for a place where at least one person would listen. Now the room listened. "I did not want to make you afraid," the letter continued, the words shaped like the woman who had written them. Plain, practical, urgent with tenderness. "There is so much I did not tell you, because I wanted to make your days as gentle as mine. I could not stop what came for me, but I could plan for you." Marcus's face moved with those words. A flicker passed through him. Grief braided with a child's newly forming understanding that planning can be a kind of love. "I taught in a small school," the letter said. And that sentence was a world. A teacher who did not wear a title of grandeur, but carried the weight of shaping mornings for a dozen kids who came hungry for knowledge and sometimes for breakfast. "I always said to you, we are not defined by what the world counts. We are defined by what we tend." The conference room was still. except for the sound of James's voice and the faint city hum beyond the glass. Richard's fingers dug into the arm of the chair. He had been, until a short hour ago, a man who measured worth by ledgers and standings. He looked at the scribbled signature at the bottom of the page, Linda Chen, and something in him that had been perfectly satisfied with hierarchy felt the first awkward scrape of disruption. "She mentions a trustee," James said, pausing to glance at a clause printed in quick legalese but underscored by the human note of the handwritten letter that accompanied it. Managed disbursement, monthly amounts, a guardian clause. "Guardian?" Richard repeated. The word sounded hollowing out a space in him. He had not yet chosen an ally in this story, only a posture. Marcus wrapped his fingers around the card again, and for a moment, a boy and a bank were the only things in the universe. He thought about the hours his mother had sat at the kitchen table, correcting homework with a pencil stub, talking about algebra as though it were a kind of music, smoothing his hair before school with fingers that smelled faintly of chalk. He thought about how she tacked motivational sayings above the stove, small, stubborn affirmations: work true, save small, love loudly. The letter's next lines made the room breathe like a thing about to be reborn, or judged, depending on how you leaned toward life. "I could not pay for every comfort," the handwriting said. "There were days I ate last, and nights I worked until my eyes blurred. But I saved." "Not because money would fix everything, it will not, but because I wanted them to have a steady ground when I could no longer stand." Marcus blinked. The sound of the clock on the wall ticked. He had held this letter like a relic, but now it began to do its work. Names were mentioned: Mrs. Rodriguez, who would bring warm bread; the neighbor who could be called for a night sit; small maps of community support Linda had sketched like a teacher's lesson plan for life. "There is a trust," James read aloud, almost as if testing the word in a mouth that had not often spoken such ordinary human tenderness. She named a trustee. She named provisions so they are not left undone. Richard's face shifted then, no more the confident smirk, but something brittle, a human crack. A million small decisions had added up to the life he inhabited. Choices about hires, about bonuses, about how to dress the room with gilded certainty. Here, in the quiet of a child's folded letter, was a life measured in margins and consent and love that had been paid into the slow river of a policy. "Why would someone who taught save for that long?" Richard blurted. It was not a question meant for disdain so much as it was a plea for the universe to explain itself. Why not spend on now? If she lived simply, why would she set aside something that looks large? James finished for him, because the room did not want to name the full weight of the number it had seen. He clicked his tablet and a document opened more fully, lines of accounting that traced small, regular payments over many years. She saved through tutoring, through a second job. She made small payments regularly. Marcus's throat tightened. The confession in his chest was knotted with pride and a sorrow he couldn't place. He knew the lengths his mother had gone to, the hours grading papers by the light of a microwave clock, the extra math classes for neighbors' children, the gloves she wore in winter when the heat at home didn't reach the corners. He had seen the jars on the pantry shelf labeled in neat handwriting, savings, future. He had watched her clip coupons and hem his jackets and take the bus instead of a ride so she could keep the small payments flowing into a future she would not live to teach in. Outside the window the city pulsed, unaware of how a life measured in love had thrust a number into a room that had always valued the other kind. Inside, the air was full of a softer arithmetic, months of lunches skipped, nights of tutoring, the unremarked economies of a life that chose the children's tomorrow over a mother's present. "This can't be right," someone murmured. But the documents on the tablet did not care for murmurs. They were records, patient and stubborn as stone, of a woman who had balanced impossible energies and had left an account that refused to fit the tidy prejudices of the lobby. Richard set the pen down, and there was a tremor to his hands that was not from age and not fully from rage. It was the tremor of a man recognizing that his private rules had been violated by a public act of decency. He had been prepared to be amused, to point and file the incident away as one more eccentricity the world brings. Instead, he had been given something unnerving, an enforced mirror. "Who is the trustee?" he asked, voice lower. He needed a procedural handle, a way to fold the truth back into manageable form. If there was a trustee they could talk to, instruct, or question, then the ledger would be a thing to be controlled. If it was a stranger, then someone else had already chosen for the children a path that bypassed the bank's corrections. "The paperwork names a local attorney," James said, "and a small community trust as secondary. There are also letters from neighbors. She planned for contingencies. It's thorough." He hesitated at that last word, as if the plainness of it contained more than the sum of its parts. Linda Chen, simple teacher, planner of contingencies, built a scaffold for 2 children out of the small bones of daily living. Marcus swallowed hard. The room spun narrow and then widened into something almost tender. He felt the hum of people's gazes like pressure, and the air of the bank like a world that had not yet decided whether to forgive itself. He knew, in the way children know certain things about adult spaces, that this would not erase the mornings that had no breakfast, or the nights when the rent notice sat heavy on their kitchen table. But it could make breathing easier, for a while. It could buy a room of calm. Richard's face folded into an expression that had the textured lines of a man who was learning that wealth makes hard choices visible, but does not, by itself, make good choices gentler. He had a million ways to argue, and one, surprisingly human way to act. He could choose how to respond, now that his assumptions had been contradicted. He could lean into the instincts that had made him sharp and unyielding, or he could let a crack open in him and let something softer through. He closed his eyes for a moment. When they opened, they were clearer. "We will verify everything," he said. The words were procedural, but his shoulders betrayed the web of something else, curiosity perhaps, and an unsettlement that felt less like virtue and more like recognition. "Until then," James said, in a voice that was both practical and kindly, "we'll make sure Marcus has what he needs: food, temporary arrangements, a place to go if necessary. We can't leave him on the street." The promise landed with the gravity of small salvation. Marcus looked down at his hands, and then up at the faces around him. He was careful not to let hope rush him. Hope can break if handled like a fragile object. Someone from security was tasked with finding a temporary guardian. James made calls and scribbled names. The bank, which had been a stage for derision an hour earlier, now hustled with motions that might, to an observer, look like competence, and to a more careful eye, look like a fledgling attempt to repair wrongdoing with action. Richard sat back and watched. He had always assumed institutions like his were insulated from the messy particulars of human sorrow. Today, the particulars had walked into his lobby. Marcus's mother had been, in her modest way, both humble and radical. She had managed to convert scarcity into provision and left instructions that bypassed snobbery. Linda Chen had named a future and the language she had always used with children: clear, patient, and grounded. Marcus was tired. He missed his mother like a person misses the ground after falling. He had not wanted to be the child who entered a bank to ask a question and ended up as the subject of 1,000 private reckonings. He had only wanted a balance. There was an irony that hung in the room like a cold thing. Figures had the power to shame and to save. When they rose from the table, Richard lingered. He was thinking in the way men like him think, in loops of policy, reputation, and the arithmetic of risk. But he was also thinking of something he had not expected to think of, the teacher who, by saving small sums with stubborn fidelity, had undermined the quiet arrogance of a lobby built to judge. Outside, the city moved on. A bus coughed, a cyclist passed, a street vendor shouted about tamales. Marcus walked through the corridor back into the lobby, and for a moment, under the chandelier's coin of light, the lobby looked less like a temple and more like a room where some small, messy human truth had been exposed. "If stories like this move you, subscribe for more," James murmured to no one in particular as he held the conference door open. The sentence felt clumsy and out of place, like a leaf stuck to a dress in a moment that had nothing to do with promotion. It was the only invitation the bank allowed itself to the world beyond its policies, the recognition that some stories must be seen to be believed. They led Marcus out the back way so the crowd would not follow. Janet watched him go with an expression that was private and soft. In the courier dark of the bank's rear exit, the city felt closer and less polished. There were delivery trucks and a smell of cooking oil, and somewhere a woman shouted the name of her child. Passengers on the sidewalk glanced past him. A neighbor from the building across the street, Gloria, recognized his face and crossed over, her own grocery bags thumping against her legs. She took his arm without fuss and asked 100 practical questions about where he had slept last night, whether his sister Emma was with him, whether he had eaten. "She'll be all right," Gloria said before he could answer, as if the future of all children in their block was a matter of confident assertion more than statistics. "We look out for each other." Marcus told her his sister was at a neighbor's because he had left to check the balance. He had not planned for how many hands the world would hold at the sight of his mother's name on a bank screen. He had not planned for a businessman to look up and feel something that resembled shame. He had not planned that the thing he had asked for in a voice smaller than the lobby would ripple and tangle into someone else's conscience. Back at the bank, Richard made a call to his assistant. He asked for briefings, memos, and, finally, the trustee's contact information. For the first time in a long time, he felt a small tug toward a human truth that the ledger could not capture. That dignity is not measured in attire, and that a life of quiet labor can accumulate value in ways accounting often misses. He wrote down the trustee's name with a pen that felt heavy in his hand. And somewhere beneath the businesslike clatter, there was a quieter movement in him, as if a page in his own ledger had been turned, not by balance, but by recognition. On the walk home, Marcus kept the letter folded in his jacket pocket. Every now and then he smoothed it with a fingertip as if he could keep its edges from fraying. He thought about his mother's laugh, which lived in the memory of the way she corrected sentences not to punish but to tease out better ones. He thought about the jars labeled savings, future, and about how someone could choose to spend her life ensuring a future that would not include her. The city folded itself around them. People balancing their own small urgencies, a dog barking at a subway grate, a bus peeling away. Marcus and Gloria moved through it together, two figures in a long stream of lives. Behind them, the bank's windows caught the afternoon sun and threw it back like a question. Inside the safe, some clerk somewhere was tapping at keys and filing Linda Chen's name under a header that did not yet understand the full consequences of her choice. Outside, a boy held the small hinge of a lifetime in an envelope and did not yet know how loud his mother's decision would be when the world started to listen. They had not yet decided the guardian, the place they would move to, or what school the children would attend. They had not yet decided how the bank would apologize, or whether Richard Blackwell would do more than feel shame for a moment. They had not yet read the entire letter aloud, where Linda's voice would tell them not only what she had done, but why she had done it, the lesson that money could never teach, but planning could honor. For now, there was only the slow work of wading back into ordinary life, and the strange, sharp relief that someone had left with small, attentive hands, a lifeline in the form of careful calculations and a teacher's steadfast heart. The ledger had spoken. The question was what the people who had heard it would do next. They walked out through the side door into a late afternoon that smelled of fry oil and dust and the kind of heat that makes people keep their voices low. Gloria let Marcus lean on her as they crossed the block, and Mrs. Rodriguez emerged from a stoop to take Emma's hand. Neighbors fell into place around them like someone had remembered an old map and was filling in the routes. There was no parade. There were paper plates and casseroles and a folding table in Mrs. Rodriguez's small living room that had seen baptisms and birthdays and too many hard winters. People brought what they could: secondhand blankets, donations of sneakers in the right size, an old lamp that flickered but produced light. Those gifts were practical and immediate and, in a way that suited Marcus's mother, organized by need rather than spectacle. James stayed long enough to make sure the immediate needs were met. He introduced Marcus and Emma to a woman named Ellen Patterson, whose name came up in Linda's letter and who had been a trusted neighbor for years. Ellen had a steady manner and hands that had once taught Sunday school and now worked part-time at the community center. She did not ask for more than the children offered. She listened to their story and let a quiet yes settle in. "I can take them for now," Ellen said, as if the taking were simple. Her voice carried the kind of competence that comes from years of doing practical goodness. "I'll get their papers filed, and we'll make sure Emma starts school Monday. Marcus, you can come by the center whenever. There's a desk in the after-school room with your name if you want it." Marcus wanted to ask if Ellen would teach him to make a proper resume or how to stop missing a person so much. He kept his questions small. For now, he accepted that someone would sit with them through the first nights. That evening, the apartment looked exactly like a life that had been lived on careful margins. A collection of mismatched plates, a calendar marked with tuition due dates, a stack of graded worksheets tied with elastic. The jar labeled "Savings, Future" still sat in the kitchen, its lid sticky from years of being opened and closed. Marcus found himself staring at it until the words on Linda's sticky note to herself unfurled in his memory. "Keep small, keep steady." The trustee arrived the next morning with a soft-spoken lawyer and a woman from the local community fund that Linda had named as backup. They moved through the legalities with the kind of respect that translated into plain speech. Monthly disbursements had been written to cover housing, education, and basic living costs. A guardian clause named Ellen Patterson as a preferred temporary guardian. A full release of funds at age 25 had been set in place to keep the children's future steady. Nothing sudden, no lavish access. Stability, the documents read, a ladder of safety. The trustee explained the practicalities with a clarity that sounded like a teacher's lesson plan. "It's designed so you can breathe," the trustee said gently to Marcus, "not to make you rich overnight, but to make daily life manageable." Marcus breathed anyway, and the air did not feel automatic in his lungs. He kept touching the letter in his pocket as if it were a talisman. Word of the story spread. A local reporter called the bank for comment and received a press release that tried to sound formal and small. It mentioned that the matter would be handled discreetly and that the bank was cooperating with the trustee. That formal statement did not travel far compared to the images and the whispered retelling of a 12-year-old being laughed at and then being revealed as the heir to a sizable trust. The story found its way into small community threads and larger feeds, and people began to stitch together their own opinions about propriety and justice. Inside the bank, Richard Blackwell felt what it is to be measured by something other than a ledger. He walked the corridor that led to his office and saw his own reflection in the high-gloss surface of another building. He had always liked the way glass made you look purposeful. Now he saw a stranger who had laughed in a hall and felt the echo of that sound like a bruise. He convened a few quiet meetings that first week, with James, with the head of compliance, with a young analyst whose work he respected. He asked questions that were not purely fiscal. He asked, uncomfortably, about how the bank's culture had allowed a child to be mocked in its lobby. He asked who trained the front desk. He listened to answers that were careful and defensive, and to one that surprised him, an admission from a middle manager that the bank had never considered its lobby might be a stage where social contempt could play out so nakedly. Protocols are not just forms, James said once, when they had a long conversation about dignity and policies that did more than check boxes. They are the way we teach a place to behave. If the bank's procedures allow for humiliation by default, then our protocols are broken. It would have been easy for Richard to treat that as a neat lesson and then file it under moral growth like a quarterly report. Instead, something in him unfurled with an urgency that had less to do with reputation and more to do with recognition. He authorized a small, swift set of changes: retraining for front desk staff on empathy and screening for discriminatory behavior, a modest emergency fund to be accessed quickly for situations involving vulnerable clients, a partnership with local community groups to guide the bank on neighborhood needs. He fought with a board member who called these ideas PR theater and found himself arguing with a fervor that surprised him. "This isn't about optics," he told his board, voice low and steady. "It's about what kind of institution we are. We can count profits, or we can count people. Counting people will keep us honest when the ledgers fail to tell the whole story." Some of the board rolled their eyes. Some nodded with the weary cynicism of people who had heard personal awakening speeches before. But Richard had a small power left, enough influence to direct money and policy where it would matter. He designated a scholarship for students from local public schools, secured seed money for an education fund in Linda Chen's name, and insisted on a yearly audit by the community fund named in Linda's documents to ensure the money served real needs rather than PR narratives. At the community center, Ellen and the neighbors organized a moving day. The little apartment they had lived in was packed into boxes with the same care Linda had used to pack lunches. Sensible, efficient, and somehow tender. People worked in pairs, carrying a bookshelf that had held graded essays and worn stickers, a child's desk with a groove of pencil marks in its top. Someone brought a radio and found Linda's favorite station that played music low and familiar. Mrs. Rodriguez made sure the kettle was always on. Marcus moved into a modest apartment supplied through the trust's housing provision. It had sunlight and a closet big enough for Emma's dresses. The refrigerator hummed like a new promise. Ellen, who lived nearby, made sure they had a routine. Emma to school at 8, Marcus to the center at after-school time, meals at regular intervals, a therapist who would come by for check-ins when Marcus felt the words inside him knot up too tight to let out. The grief did not leave suddenly. It came in nights when Marcus woke up and felt the bed empty. It sat with him at the dinner table and refused to go to school with him. But the structure Linda had left, the papers that spelled out small monthly allowances, meant that grief could be held while practical things were taken care of. It was important to Marcus that Linda's intentions were honored. He found himself thinking like his mother, small, steady choices that added up. He began to write a list on a lined notebook his mother would have liked, a plan for the scholarship he wanted to start, names of neighbors who needed a hand, a schedule for tutoring younger kids at the center. When he spoke to Ellen about it, she put down her cup and smiled. "You make sure you live a good life, Marcus," she said. "Then we'll make sure your mother didn't do all that work for nothing." The bank's reforms, small as they were, rippled out. The front desk staff received sensitivity training and new responsibilities that included a community liaison role. The emergency fund allowed James to make swift purchases for basic needs without onerous approvals. One teller, who had been working 2 other jobs to make ends meet, found out the bank had reviewed its employee assistance policies and could apply for support. It did not fix broader systemic problems. Wages citywide did not double overnight, and children's education still depended on underfunded public systems. But for the people who walked into this bank in the weeks after Linda's story broke, the lobby felt different, quieter, more attentive. Patrons who once hunched their shoulders grew a little straighter. Richard did not make all his remorse an abstract thing. He started to volunteer on Fridays at the community center, at first awkwardly, arriving with nice shoes and stiff hands, but staying long enough to learn how to fix a leaky cabinet door or tape up a poster the right way. He sat with kids over math problems and found himself trying to remember simpler forms of wonder he had not felt since his own parents' house smelled of toast on Sunday mornings. He listened when Marcus spoke about the plan for a foundation to support working families who were trying to make small savings grow. And he listened, too, to the memory of Linda, who had saved each month as though it were a vow. When Marcus suggested creating a foundation to provide small, practical grants to educators and families, money for tutoring, funds for school supplies, seed money for emergency housing needs, Richard surprised him by offering a matching gift from his own foundation. He did not make a show of it. He arranged for board approvals and insisted the donation be administered by the community fund Linda herself had named. He wrote a check quietly, and when the staff tried to make it more visible, he insisted the optics mattered less than the stewardship. It shouldn't be about headlines, he told them. It should be about doing it right. Marcus accepted the gesture with a wariness born of new experience. He had seen people toss coins to bodies in pain and call themselves generous. He had also seen neighbors who gave their time and did not ask to be thanked. He wanted this to be different. He wanted accountability. He wanted Linda's name kept central and the money to be used in ways that mirrored her approach, careful, targeted, and respectful. They set up governance structures that reflected Linda's values. Grants would be small and reviewed by a panel that included community members, Mrs. Rodriguez, Ellen, 2 teachers from the neighborhood, and a young social worker. The aim was not to create a foundation that administered largesse remotely, but to create a small, nimble instrument that could address specific, immediate needs in ways that kept recipients' dignity intact. Applications were short, human-focused, and turned around quickly. The first grant went to a single mother who worked nights at a care facility and needed a reliable laptop for her online coursework. The second covered textbooks for a group of children whose family's budget had been stretched thin by medical bills. Each time a grant was used, Marcus and Ellen would visit the recipient, bringing with them the courtesy of human attention Linda had modeled, a conversation, a cup of tea, a few minutes of genuine listening. Word traveled, slowly and honestly, that this money was not a spectacle. It was a small tool for steady lives. Meanwhile, Richard's public apology unfolded without pageantry. He asked for a meeting with Marcus and Ellen in a small room that smelled of lemon cleaner, not of expensive polish. He came without a suit jacket, which made him look smaller and oddly more human. "I was cruel in that lobby," he said, looking at Marcus with a clarity that made the child blink. "I made assumptions. I failed you. I can't undo that. But I will be responsible for how my institution responds." Marcus did not leap into forgiveness. He had watched grown people promise and then retreat. He looked at Richard and saw a man who was trying to recompose himself. Marcus had learned the hard way how long it takes for trust to be rebuilt. "Words are cheap," he said, "but the bank can do some real stuff for people, like us. Make sure it stays that way." Richard nodded. "I will," he said. "And if it fails, if the bank slips back into old habits, call me out. You have my word." They shook hands in a way that felt like a truce. It was not absolution. It was a mutual recognition of a work that had to be done. The city, which was impatient and hungry for narratives, watched as the story grew a second layer. When Marcus stood before a small camera months later, he did not speak with the tremor of the first day. He had learned to speak in the way his mother had taught children how to start essays, with clarity, with plain passion. "She taught me arithmetic and how to keep things neat," he told the reporter. "But she also taught me how to make a plan. Money doesn't mean you are better. It just means you can buy breathing space sometimes. We're using that space to help people who need a hand." The interview was modest. It aired on a weekday afternoon with a segment that balanced human interest and small investigative rigor. The bank's policy changes were documented: a modest scholarship fund in Linda Chen's name, the Emergency Assistance Program, and the new Community Advisory Board. Journalists asked tough questions about why a private bank would be the actor of change and whether those changes were enough. Marcus answered that nothing about a single bank's action would solve everything. "But it can help people," he said simply. "And sometimes helping people is how you start." Richard stood with Marcus during one of the interviews and watched him speak. There was something in his posture that had shifted, a measure of humility that was not performative. After the cameras left, he did something less visible. He called a meeting with recruitment and compensation and asked them to re-evaluate how support staff were paid, to consider living wages and benefits. It was a battle he lost on some points and won on others. The bank approved a pilot program for better benefits for certain categories of staff and expanded its volunteer grants for community organizations. It was not a revolution, but it was change, and it had been catalyzed by a 12-year-old with a card and a letter. Marcus, persistent in a way that suited his mother's teachings, channeled his grief into building the small foundation. The board, a humble and neighborhood-driven group, moved slowly and carefully. They wrote grants the way Linda had written lesson plans: specific, realistic, and with an eye for impact. They offered school supply packs before the first bell and emergency cash grants when rent threatened to push a family into a corner. They sponsored an after-school math club where Marcus volunteered. Each Thursday he would help kids with algebra, less like a savior and more like a tutor who knew the music of numbers by heart. Emma changed too. At 8, she had been shy and sharp in ways only children can be. Blunt one moment, ferocious in play the next. In a new school, with new rules and new teachers, she began to show herself in ways that made neighbors say, "She looks like her mother." She drew pictures of a teacher with a chalkboard and of 2 kids holding hands. Her drawings were placed on the refrigerator like small proclamations of continuity. There were setbacks. A grant application was mishandled, and someone in the neighborhood felt judged. A council meeting about zoning interfered with plans for a community garden. A bank executive balked at the cost of an expanded employee benefits plan. Marcus learned early that moral work always had friction and that patience meant pushing while accepting delays. He learned, too, that Linda's voice could be a compass. We are not defined by what the world counts. We are defined by what we tend. Time, which in its quiet way measures everything, kept moving. Seasons turned, leaves fell, and then came back. The foundation grew slowly but reliably. It funded scholarships for local students who wanted to be teachers, like Linda, people who understood the difference between rote lists and real lessons. It set up a modest emergency stipend that was dispersed with a dignity clause. Recipients received the money with a personal visit and a commitment of follow-up support, not a humiliating application process. The bank published an annual report about the changes, and the community read it, scanned it for sincerity, and in many cases found more than they had expected. They found out that a teller whose childcare costs had been subsidized by the emergency fund had been able to finish a degree. They learned of a small business that received a micro-grant to fix a broken refrigerator, saving several neighborhood jobs. The report was careful to note that the bank's responsibilities were limited, that systemic change required broader policy shifts and public investment, but that private institutions could act responsibly within their sphere. Richard visited the community center more and more. He became available in a way that made people test his consistency. He sat on the floor during story time and tried not to be the odd man in the room with the expensive watch. He listened when someone told him about another child who needed consistent tutoring. He became a kind of apprentice in humility, learning not to make the center into a stage for his redemption. He met with council members to argue for school budgets in ways that had cost him credibility with some associates. Some of his colleagues criticized him for being naive. Others admired his willingness to stick his neck out. A small crisis tested the work. A contractor mismanaged a grant for a community after-school kitchen, and the space had to close for a month. Marcus and Ellen scrambled. They held bake sales, asked Richard's bank to release emergency funds quickly, and reached out to local businesses for in-kind donations. The closure was painful and public. The neighbors gathered and argued and cleaned and repainted. When it reopened, there was a wall mural painted jointly by children and elders. A teacher at a chalkboard, chalk dust in the air, a jar labeled Savings, Future, painted in bright letters. The mural represented, in the way art does, the messy persistence of a community that refused to be defined by scarcity. In the midst of these practical struggles, Marcus grew. He learned grant writing and accountability. He practiced public speaking and became adept at interviews that required more than emotion. His presence became an argument for dignity. He held on to the private things that mattered: a picture of his mother on his bedroom wall, a small tin in which he kept the last pencil she used to grade a test. He kept the letter folded and refolded, as if the repeated handling would make the words more alive. A year after the lobby incident, the community held a small event to mark the foundation's first round of grants. There was a modest crowd: neighbors, a few bank people who had come because they had been asked, the trustee, and a local council member who had helped with a small education line item. Marcus spoke first. "My mother taught me that the smallest actions can outlast the loudest words," he said, voice steady. "She taught me the dignity of planning and the importance of making sure that a life is lived in a way that leaves room for others to breathe." Richard followed with a short statement that avoided sacrament and confession alike. He thanked the community for patience and honesty and promised continued partnership. He spoke of learning and of the ways institutions could better listen to the people they serve. There was applause that was honest and not excessive. The press covered the event with measured curiosity. The story was not the viral sensation it had been in the early days. It had matured into a more complex conversation about policy and accountability. People began to talk in more sophisticated terms about how philanthropy can be used to patch gaps temporarily and how public investment is indispensable for long-term solutions. Marcus listened to those discussions and felt glad that nuance had arrived. He wanted the work to be sustainable and to avoid becoming just another anecdote in someone's moral short-term memory. As months turned into another season, Emma started receiving letters from a new teacher who invited her into a reading circle. Marcus found himself volunteering to lead a math group and discovered a deep satisfaction in watching a child's eyes open when a concept clicked. He sat in the back of the classroom sometimes, watching as a teacher, not quite like his mother, but competent and caring, held a group of kids with patience and small firmness. He thought of Linda, of the way she had measured each day as if it were a small ledger that needed tending. Richard began a ritual of his own. Once a week, he would sit in the lobby's small public seating area without company and watch people come and go. He would take notes on the experience, not for stockholders, but for himself. He noticed how many people entered with a purposeful calm and how many moved with worry like a coat. He started to write down policies he wanted to lobby for, small and practical things that might be replicated. faster emergency disbursements, a local advisory council for neighborhood accounts, a scholarship for children of educators who worked multiple jobs. There was resistance within the bank, of course. Some executives argued that emotional undertakings had little place in an institution designed to manage risk. Others welcomed the steadier culture it created and argued that good public relations and good policy were not mutually exclusive. Richard had to learn to fight the right fights. Which boardroom arguments would he win, and which ones would he concede? He learned to be strategic and patient. At the one-year mark, a small documentary crew came by the community center to film a short piece for a public interest series. They filmed Marcus teaching a math problem and then sat down with Ellen and Mrs. Rodriguez, who spoke plainly about the steady work of neighbors banding together. They recorded Richard talking about policy and the bank's new community liaison office. The piece did not glamorize anyone. It showed a messy, deliberate attempt at change. Policy memos, people painting a mural, kids with coloring pencils. The voiceover said nothing grandiose. It ended with Marcus closing the booklet he had made that outlined the foundation's first year. "Money showed up," Marcus said in the final line of the piece, "but what mattered was what people did with it." The documentary aired on a slow Sunday evening to modest ratings. The reactions were mixed but thoughtful. Many viewers praised the bank's shift. Some emphasized the importance of structural change beyond corporate action. The story helped nudge public conversations about what private institutions could do to be better neighbors. Years moved along with their habitual slowness and insistence. Marcus finished secondary school and enrolled part-time at a community college while running the foundation. He took night classes in nonprofit management, the kind of practical knowledge his mother would have relished. He learned to manage budgets, to create documents that balanced compassion with accountability, and to recruit good people who shared a pragmatic vision, help now and build capacity for later. Emma started to sing in a school choir and won a small award for a science fair project about water filtration that made a neighbor beam with proud tears. She wrote to Marcus about the smell of rain when she came home. Marcus kept the letters she wrote and sometimes read them late at night when the apartment was quiet. The trust's monthly checks continued to be administered with the same quiet efficiency Linda had wanted. They did not remove longing, but they made sure the light stayed on and the children could breathe. Richard, older around the eyes, kept visiting. He no longer felt the need to be seen every time he entered the center. He volunteered in ways that fit the schedule, mentoring a young bank analyst who wanted to work in community finance, speaking at a local conference about corporate responsibility, writing op-eds that argued for partnerships between public and private sectors. His journey was not linear nor complete. He still found himself defensive at times. The armor of his old self did not come off all at once, but the armor had been scored and softened. One crisp morning, Marcus received a letter in the mail with a blue envelope and the return address of a philanthropic foundation that had taken note of his work. They offered a small mentorship grant, enough to hire an administrative assistant and allow Marcus to devote more of his time to outreach. He wrote back with a neat, grateful hand and included, as if a talisman, a copy of Linda's old letter folded into the package. "Your mother did a thing that made me see the world differently," he wrote. "I want to make the work she opened continue." The assistant they hired was a recent graduate who had grown up in a similar neighborhood and wanted to help people without making headlines. She taught Marcus about databases and scheduling and how to write grant reports that didn't strip away the human stories. They worked together to design a program that offered micro-grants matched with mentorship, practical help paired with relational support. There were little victories along the way. A child who passed an entrance exam to a specialized high school, a neighbor who replaced a broken furnace with help from a fund, A teacher who received a small stipend for classroom supplies and later wrote a letter to Linda's foundation that said simply, "Your money taught my students that someone believed in their learning." Yet, even as practical outcomes accumulated, the deeper work remained. Marcus still lay awake sometimes and thought of the day he had walked into the lobby with a card and a question. He wondered how many other Lindas were making similar sacrifices without a plan that had been recognized. He wondered how many more teachers and nurses and parents were compressing their lives into jars labeled future, and if any of them would ever be heard. That question propelled the foundation into modest advocacy work. They started to convene panels where educators could speak about the pressures they faced and where community members could liaise with public officials. Marcus understood the limits of a single nonprofit. They could not rewrite municipal budgets, but they could offer data, stories, and partnerships that nudged policy. The foundation published a small report on the financial precarity of neighborhood educators, and the local council used some of its findings to argue for a pilot program in teacher stipends. The change was incremental and fragile, but that was the pattern Linda had taught: small savings and steady advocacy. At home, the apartment became a gallery of the small life they had rebuilt. Drawings on the refrigerator, a framed photograph of Linda taken at a school Christmas pageant, a shelf of books Marcus had collected for the math club. There was a standard mug with a chipped rim that Marcus had found in a thrift store and loved for its imperfection. The kitchen clock ticked like a heartbeat. On a late autumn afternoon, sun thin and gold behind a line of trees, Richard visited unannounced. He carried a small bouquet wrapped in paper, which felt slightly awkward in the hands of a man who had never been to many funerals. He left it on the table and sat with Marcus and Ellen, and for a while the three of them simply sat in companionable silence. Then Richard reached into his jacket and produced a small envelope. "There are things I've wanted to say," he began. "I don't think an apology is enough. I also don't want to keep doing what feels like symbolic gestures. So I wanted to ask if the foundation would consider a small partnership with the bank's community fund to underwrite a program for educators who work double shifts." Marcus looked at Ellen, who nodded. It was a practical offer with conditions: community oversight, that the fund's decisions not be solely controlled by the bank, and that Linda's name be used respectfully. "We'll consider it," Marcus said. It was a heavier way of saying yes. The partnership would be negotiated and messy, but the conversation was real. They spoke then of other things that were not easy. Richard confessed to an instinct to protect the institution he had stewarded, sometimes at the expense of human nuance. He described nights of thinking about his own upbringing and how comfortable he had been with certain kinds of people, and how disruptive it had felt to have that assumption pulled away. Marcus listened without scolding. There was a quiet dignity in both of them. Marcus's grief and Richard's contrition measured in a shared desire to do better. Years later, during a small gallery opening at the community center where neighborhood children's art hung alongside Linda's old lesson plans, a new kind of audience gathered. There were teachers with paint on their hands, retired neighbors who brought brownies, a few bank employees who no longer feared being seen without their status. There were people who had learned, sometimes painfully, to allow their hearts to be taught. At the center, Marcus walked the room and paused at a framed letter, one of Linda's old notes to him, reproduced and displayed. He read the lines, "We are not defined by what the world counts. We are defined by what we tend." He pressed his palm to the frame like a benediction. Later, Richard stood by a window and watched children run in a courtyard newly paved by a grant of the foundation. They had painted games on the asphalt, hopscotch squares, and number lines. He looked at a small sketch taped to the glass, a child's drawing of a bank, not as a citadel, but as a door with an open sign. He felt an unfamiliar lightness and the slow accruing of a different wealth. The city kept its complex rhythms. Not everything had changed. There were still structural problems that made people shout in council chambers, and still some days when funding was thin. But a modest, durable thing had been planted. A community acting with its own agency. A foundation honoring the careful work of a teacher. And an institution that had been nudged to account for its own interior life. On an unremarkable Tuesday, a reporter asked Marcus whether the number on that old screen, the cold, impossible figure that had shocked a lobby, had changed the meaning of his mother's life. "It mattered," Marcus replied plainly. "Numbers gave us the space to breathe. But the number didn't teach me how to be kind or how to plan. My mother did. Her choices made that number useful. The real change began when people started listening to what she left behind." Richard, sitting in the back of the room, watched Marcus speak and thought about the ledger of his own life. He had once believed that wealth was a shield. Now he saw it as a responsibility, heavy but honest. He had learned that apology is only the first step. Action and accountability follow, and they must be sustained. Months later, in a quiet ceremony, the community organized not to praise anyone, but to acknowledge the work that had gone into sustaining it. The foundation announced a new fellowship in Linda's name for neighborhood educators who wanted to pursue further training without leaving their communities. The fellowship was small and meaningful. Its selection process included teachers recommending each other and community members vetting applicants. It did not make headlines beyond the neighborhood, but it made teachers cry when they received the notice. They called Marcus and said thank you, and he would answer with the private smile of someone honoring a promise. On a soft winter evening, with snow not yet fallen, but the air carrying the threat of it, Marcus sat at his desk and read a letter from someone who had received a grant months earlier. The letter thanked the foundation for helping a student stay in school. The writer wrote about how the small stability had allowed them to catch up on sleep and to borrow an old library computer for essays. Marcus felt the familiar knot at the throat and folded the letter into the old tin where he kept the pencil his mother used. He walked to the small corner of the living room where a frame held the first photograph he had of his mother teaching a classroom. In the image, she leaned over a child explaining a fraction with the patient intensity of an educator who believed that knowledge was the kind of thing that altered futures. He read Linda's last line again, the one he had clung to all these years. "Tend what you can now, leave the rest well planned." Outside, helicopters rumbled in the distance, and someone played a piano down the street in a building with an open window. Inside, Richard, Marcus, Ellen, and a handful of neighbors shared a potluck of modest dishes. They talked about the mundane things, the city's potholes, the school's winter performance, the possibility of expanding a tutoring program. They joked about Richard's awkward attempts at baking, and he laughed in a way that no longer felt like a man trying on someone else's clothes. When the night wound down, Richard stood at the window and looked out. He saw children returning from evening classes, coats flapping, and a neighbor bringing in an elderly man's newspaper. He saw the little details he had once ignored, the small economies, the human systems of care that held neighborhoods together. He turned back and saw a drawing tacked to the wall, a house, a teacher, a jar marked savings, future. He thought about the ledger on that first day, the numbers that had shocked a lobby into reconsideration. He felt now a different measurement rising in him, the sum of small acts over time. As the group dispersed, Marcus picked up Linda's letter and read it once more at the doorway. He folded it carefully and slipped it back into his pocket. He looked at Richard and then at the people who had come to be neighbors and allies and stewards. "Thank you," he said simply, meaning the bank's action and the community's patience and the small, steady work of everyone in the room. Richard nodded. "Thank you for keeping her lessons alive," he said. They stood for a minute in a silence more full than any words could claim. Then they closed the door on the warmth and stepped out into the street where the city kept going, always moving toward more work. The number on the screen had been a rupture, a bright, startling fact that forced scrutiny. But it was what came after, the patient, unglamorous work of tending that became the legacy. Linda had left a plan folded into a letter. The plan had been honored by people who, imperfectly, chose to do the right thing. That decision rippled. A child's grief was held with care. Community institutions learned to listen. A bank adjusted its priorities, and a foundation began to seed modest hope where it mattered. Marcus kept teaching kids at the center. Emma grew taller and louder in the best ways. Ellen kept watching over them like a steady lighthouse. Mrs. Rodriguez baked a pie every holiday and made sure to deliver a slice to those who needed it most. Richard kept writing policies into memos and learning how to be accountable in public ways. The city remained complicated and sometimes cruel, but a new current flowed through a small neighborhood, one that favored dignity and that held, as Linda had wanted, the value of planning. Years from the day Marcus had walked in with a card the size of a postage stamp, people still remembered the image of a boy in duct-taped sneakers standing under a chandelier that had thrown coins of light. They also remembered the hand that had folded a letter and left instructions, the neighbors who had gathered without fanfare, and the slow work that followed. The photograph of Linda teaching hung in a community room that had been renovated with a grant and had a plaque that read, simply, "For those who tend." On the last page of a small booklet the foundation had produced, someone had written a line that became a quiet motto for the folks who had been part of the story. Numbers can open doors, but what we do with a door determines the life that walks through it. Marcus kept that sentence like a promise. He had asked for a balance and received more than a sum. He got, in the end, a living answer to the question his mother had posed in Margins and Margins Again. How do we tend to what matters? If you feel moved by this story, share it with someone who needs to hear that dignity can be defended by small acts of care. And consider supporting local programs that uplift working families.